Welcome to our 18th Florida Keys Mosquito Control District Oxitec Public Educational Webinar. Our topic is mosquitoes and public health. Joining us, we have Dr. Stan Zuba. Dr. Zuba is a pediatrician and commissioner on the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District Board of Commissioners. We have Chad Huff. Chad is FKMCD's Public Education and Information Officer. Rajiv Vaidyanathan is Oxitec's Director of U.S. Programs. And I'm Meredith Fensom of Florida Native and Oxitec's Head of Public Affairs. We began this webinar series almost 2 years ago to provide a forum where especially residents of the Florida Keys, we can share information and locals can ask their questions and we can answer them. These webinars are open to everyone. They are recorded and made available for everyone after the event. The webinar is divided into two parts. For the first half hour, we'll present our materials, and then the second half hour is open for Q&A. We will prioritize questions relating to the webinar topics, and we'll also prioritize questions from Keys residents. You can start to enter your questions now in the Q&A function. So just drop them in there and please identify if you are a Keys resident, which key you live on, and we will give priority to those questions. You will remain anonymous. We're not going to identify you by name, but we are giving priority to locals. If time runs out, we accept questions in writing via florida@oxitec.com. And we may publish some of the questions and answers afterwards, but either way, they'll be a part of the recording. So our agenda is a presentation on mosquitoes as disease vectors and the challenges to public health, and then we'll move into the Q&A. And now I'll turn it over to Rajiv.
And I will unmute myself. That's a good start. Thank you, Meredith. We'd like to begin with some definitions so we all speak the same nomenclature, same vocabulary. And you may have heard of vectors, right? Mosquitoes as a vector of disease or vector control. So what is a vector? A vector is any organism that can pick up a pathogen, a disease-causing organism, from one organism and transmit it to another. And so mosquitoes are really good vectors of a number of different human and animal pathogens, as are ticks, as are fleas. So they can pick up an infectious agent from one animal and they can transmit it to another animal or to a human being. A good example of a mosquito-borne disease, a vector-borne disease, is West Nile virus. Now, full disclosure, Aedes aegypti is not a vector of West Nile virus. Dr. Zuba is going to talk about the 4 viral diseases that Aedes aegypti is a vector for, including dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, and Zika. Mosquitoes of a different genus transmit the virus responsible for West Nile fever. It's just a really good example of the complexity of this host vector pathogen interaction. So for example, with West Nile virus, typically birds are an infectious reservoir of virus. There are species of mosquitoes that feed on birds, and then after a certain time, and that's called the extrinsic incubation period, and that is the time it takes for a virus or other pathogen to replicate inside that mosquito. After a certain time, when that female mosquito feeds on a human or on a horse or on another vertebrate host, she is capable of transmitting that pathogen from the bird to another host. And so in this case, the birds act as reservoirs, the mosquito acts as a vector, And very often, the human or other animal can be an incidental host. Now, you might not know this, so it's really important to point it out. There are over 3,500 species of mosquito. People ask, well, are you controlling the mosquito? There's no such thing as the mosquito. There are over 3,500 species of mosquitoes. Some of the females feed on blood. Some of them don't have to. They can develop their eggs without feeding on blood. But there are, in those that actually bite, only the female mosquito. For any of those, only the female mosquito actually bites. And to give you some idea, just to kind of think conceptually about different mosquito species, did you know there are 3,400 species of snakes? Now, can you tell the difference, right? Can you look at a black racer or a garter snake or a Burmese python in the Everglades? It's obvious to you that they are different species. Same way, there are 3,500 species of mosquitoes. And I showed one picture here. This is Sabethes cyaneus. It's a South American species. It's actually a very beautiful species of mosquito. It's also one of the most important vectors of yellow fever virus in South America. So there are a lot of different species of mosquitoes. Some of them feed on blood, some of them don't. Surprisingly, very few of them are vectors. So most mosquitoes are not a public health concern because they don't feed on humans and they're not capable of actually transmitting a pathogen. But a very few number of species are serious. And in fact, those few species of mosquitoes are responsible for more human death than any other animal on Earth. So for example, today we're going to talk about Aedes aegypti principally. Aedes aegypti is one species of mosquito. It's a non-native invasive species in North and South America, and it is responsible for transmitting dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, and Zika. All of those are viruses. You may have heard of Eastern equine encephalitis. That's transmitted by other Aedes species, and it's a serious disease in Florida. We talked about West Nile fever, also a virus, transmitted by mosquitoes in the genus Culex. St. Louis encephalitis circulates from Florida throughout the Gulf Coast and much further north in the US. It is also transmitted by Culex mosquitoes. And maybe the most important one you've heard of is human malaria. Malaria is a protozoan disease, and it is transmitted to humans exclusively by the bite of female mosquitoes in the genus Anopheles. Just a quick reminder about the mosquito life cycle. You may be familiar with butterflies. So an egg, a caterpillar, which is the larva, a pupa, i.e. a chrysalis, and then a beautiful adult winged butterfly. Well, mosquitoes have the same life cycle. Their egg, larva, and pupa stages are all aquatic. Only the adult stages, males and females, are aerial. Females sometimes feed on blood, and they are responsible for transmitting pathogens. Here's a new term for you, a gonotrophic cycle. So the gonotrophic cycle is the time from when a female feeds on blood, digests the blood, lays her eggs, and then feeds again. Why do female mosquitoes feed on blood? Really one reason. Female mosquitoes have ovaries, like so many other females of different species. In order for a female mosquito to lay eggs, she needs protein. Many female mosquitoes never feed on blood. They have enough protein and fat sequestered from their larval development to develop the ovaries and lay eggs. However, if a female does not have the nutritional basis to develop her ovaries and lay eggs, she will feed on blood. So when a female is feeding, it's really to develop the next generation. Here is a female, Aedes aegypti, her gut full of blood. In that process, she can acquire and transmit the viruses responsible for dengue, Zika, yellow fever, and chikungunya. Now, people think, geez, I get eaten alive by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes only feed on me. Actually, mosquitoes have a very long menu. Different species of mosquitoes feed on some very particular hosts. Aedes aegypti is unique in that Aedes aegypti, this non-native invasive species in North and South America, feeds almost exclusively on human beings. But the pictures we show here give you some idea of some of the other hosts of other mosquito species. Mosquitoes could feed on amphibians like frogs, on reptiles like alligators, snakes, lizards. As you know, they can feed on birds. Birds are the most important reservoir for West Nile virus, and mosquitoes can feed on a bird, develop the virus, and when the female mosquito feeds on another host, she can act as a vector. And of course, mosquitoes feed on a number of different mammals, including dogs. Mosquitoes are the most important vector of dog heartworm. Horses, cats, rodents, and we have to include humans in that list of mammals. Now, some mosquito species are generalists. They're very opportunistic. They will feed on what's available. Others are real specialists. For example, Aedes aegypti feeds almost exclusively on humans. The mosquito Culex teratans feeds almost entirely on frogs, believe it or not. And the female Culex teratans can find the frogs based on the ribbit of frog vocalization. So they're actually attuned to ribbiting frogs. So we talked about Aedes aegypti all around here. Let's just bring it down. Why is Aedes aegypti such a good vector? It's the most important global vector for these 4 diseases: yellow fever, dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. And remember, only female mosquitoes bite because only female mosquitoes need the protein to develop their eggs. Aedes aegypti feeds almost exclusively on humans. So think about that. After feeding on one person and then feeding on the next, whatever she's picked up doesn't end up in a dead-end host, like a bird or a dog. By feeding on human after human after human, Aedes aegypti keeps viruses circulating within human populations. Remember, we talked about a gonotrophic cycle? The gonotrophic cycle is the time from which a female imbibes blood, develops ovaries, lays her eggs, and then feeds again. All species of mosquitoes feed once during their gonotrophic cycle, except for Aedes aegypti. Think about that. While most female mosquitoes will take a blood meal and then have to undergo 5, 6, 7 days before they feed again, Aedes aegypti feeds multiple times during a single gonotrophic cycle. And by feeding multiple times on multiple humans, that increases the number of infective bites. That is a very efficient vector. You've probably paid attention that Aedes aegypti feeds and breeds in and around our homes. So that also increases the risk of transmission from an infective host, human, to an uninfected person. When this species feeds on an infected human and picks up dengue virus, yellow fever, chikungunya, or Zika virus, it stays infected. So when she feeds on another host, and another host, and another host, she can transmit these viruses in her saliva. And so she has what's called a high vector competence. Vector competence means the ability of an organism, could be a mosquito, tick, flea, to take in an infectious agent and to transmit it. Aedes aegypti has high vector competence for these viruses. And the last reason Aedes aegypti is such a good vector and why we're devoting an entire presentation to it is that it is closely associated with humans. We already said it feeds and breeds in and around people's homes. And that means it is easily invasive. Tires, lucky bamboo, the saucers at the bottom of pots. Usually when people think about mosquitoes, they think about, say, a mangrove swamp or an inland floodwater plain or a large sewage system. These are large, stagnant pools of water. They stay around for a really long time. And yes, they breed a lot of mosquitoes, but they don't breed a lot of Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti is what's called a container breeding mosquito. And that means female Aedes aegypti lay their eggs on a moist substrate in small areas. Everything we mentioned, wheelbarrows, children's toys, we've collected them in jet skis, the clay saucers at the bottom of pots. As long as it's a little wet, female Aedes aegypti will lay their eggs there, and that is easily transported from county to county and from state to state. Now that we've given you an idea about the diversity of mosquito species, and we're just targeting one, and the vector competence and biology of Aedes aegypti, I'm going to defer to Dr. Zuba, and I'm going to mute my mic.
Thank you, Rajiv. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit more in detail about the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And the first thing I'd like to make everybody aware of, as Rajiv had mentioned, that it is not native to the Americas. And specifically, it is not native to the Florida Keys. So our efforts to eradicate this mosquito do not change the environmental makeup of our area, which is a very important thing to understand. For example, if we tried to get rid of the entire salt marsh mosquito population, that would change the dynamics of our biological area. So we really first discovered this species back in the 1600s, where we think it came from Africa and migrated to the Americas. And of course, it was bringing that viral disease with it. Now, the most important disease that is caused by this mosquito Aedes is the dengue virus. And it is the most common mosquito-borne disease in the world. I have some statistics that there were, I think, 350 million infections last year. And fortunately, about 80% of them are asymptomatic, but that also leaves a high percentage of people that do get sick with this disease. Some people call it breakbone fever because of the severity of the illness. Dengue fever, again, is not usually a fatal disease, but it can cause severe morbidity and a lot of pain. If it progresses to dengue hemorrhagic fever, then about 20% of people can die from this. And it's estimated that a substantial amount of people do die in the worldwide. Unfortunately, there's no widely available vaccine and no therapeutic medicine or treatment available at this time. That's why vector management is the most important thing we can do here, and it remains the most effective preventative measures that we have. If you see the little chart next to here with the people on it, you can see that once a person gets infected with dengue virus and is bitten by the mosquito, it takes about 28 days to go through a cycle where the mosquito ingests the dengue virus in a blood meal. It replicates in the mosquito over an 8 to 12 day period, and then it transmits the dengue virus to another person. And this is a rotating thing that occurs, causing the disease to spread rapidly. Now, interestingly, in the Florida Keys, we've had 2 major outbreaks of dengue, with 72 confirmed locally acquired cases in Monroe County in 2020. The last outbreak we had of locally acquired disease was back in 2010, when we had 68 cases. So most of our cases that we see in the Florida Keys are cases that are acquired non-locally. But however, in 2020, we had a substantial amount of locally acquired disease. The potential risk of Zika, chick virus, and yellow fever are also present with this invasive species. Unfortunately, it's very resistant to the types of pyrethroids we use now, and they are no longer effective. Really, what makes this a challenging, excuse me, what makes this challenging to treat is that these mosquitoes are cryptic in their harborages. In other words, they hide, and they're also diurnal, meaning that they bite during the day and the night. And their larval sites are very difficult to find and to treat. Because of this, we need more tools in our toolbox. That's why we're constantly looking for new techniques, not necessarily just insecticides or pesticides, but other novel techniques that we can use to treat this very dangerous mosquito. And we always think about the environment when we are working at mosquito control. We do not want to do anything that's going to change the environmental makeup of our keys, our beautiful keys, and that is always at the forefront of our treatments. And remember that we are doing a mosquito trial right now, and partnering with Oxitec at this point, and 9 national and state agencies have concluded that this Oxitec male release poses no risk to humans or environmental health, which I think is a very important point to be made. Yellow fever, interestingly, was first discovered back in the 1700s, and it was a deadly disease back then. About 120,000 people died in Philadelphia back then of this disease. It was endemic in the United States at that point. The yellow refers to the jaundice that occurs in the skin and eyes. It's still endemic in parts of Africa, Central and South America. And interestingly, the person that first discovered the cause of yellow fever was the Aedes mosquito, was ridiculed back in the late 1800s. And he was called the mosquito man and discredited. However, General Walter Reed did a study in Cuba where he actually took the mosquito and infected himself and others with the mosquito, and pretty much determined that this was the vector for the disease. And fortunately, now we have it under control in the United States. The last outbreak of yellow fever was in 1905 in New Orleans. Chikungunya, again, another disease that's caused by Aedes mosquitoes. And again, a lot of high fever, severe joint pains, and we've had several cases. However, it's not a big problem here in the United States, but it is in other areas of the world. And Zika started in 2016, and I can personally say that I've seen several young infants born with this that did have severe microcephaly or small heads and caused severe neurological damages from this. Fortunately, we have not had another outbreak since 2016, but like all viruses, this can change at any time. And unfortunately, there is no vaccine and no specific treatment. I'll turn it over to Chad.
All right, Dr. Zuba, thank you very much. Just talking a little bit specifically about, in particular, the Aedes aegypti and in the scope of normal mosquito control in the Florida Keys. As you can imagine, the district does a lot of trapping of mosquitoes. Mosquito surveillance is one of the legs of the stool that we have in mosquito control, and that helps us to figure out what is out there and what needs to be treated. The Aedes aegypti only represents less than 4% of the mosquitoes that we trap. There are a lot more prevalent mosquitoes out there where we trap dozens, even many times more of them available. But it's this Aedes aegypti that only represents 4% of the trappings, or less than 4%, vectors 100% of the diseases that we find in the Keys. So the question becomes, why don't you just focus all your efforts and control this one mosquito? And the answer is, it's very good at avoiding control. As Rajiv talked about earlier, it breeds very cryptically, and that is it because it's evolved around humans. It has become very adept to breeding in the things that you find around humans, and that is small containers, or refuse piles, or trash can lids, or anything like that. And so to completely to combat that, the district has basically a force of mosquito inspectors, and these inspectors go door to door in urban areas. They go property to property in more rural areas, but basically they're there as part of the source reduction effort, and that is to find these potential and current breeding sites and to get rid of them, turn them over, keep them from filling up again. And basically, this is the instrument for which we do the tip and toss that you hear us talk about over and over and over again. That is source reduction. Those same inspectors can also do hand treatments of the various the various control methods we have, whether it's a larvicide or adulticide. They can do small treatments on these properties, but as you can imagine, this is all very time consuming. There are literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of yards and properties that need to be inspected and need these attentions. And the district only has a limited number of these inspectors, less than 40, to go visit all these properties, and to do it on a repeating or a rotating basis in conjunction with any precipitation that's falling takes a lot of time. So beyond those inspectors, the district has apparatuses to help us spread various larvicides and pesticides or adulticides to help control this mosquito. So we have helicopters that help us in this regard. And again, these for the Aedes aegypti are particularly challenging to use because the pesticides and the larvicides have to come from the air. They have to fall down as either a fine mist or as a granular product, and they actually have to make their way either into contact with the Aedes aegypti itself, or in the case of larvicides, make it into the breeding receptacle that we're talking about. These are oftentimes spots that are underneath decks or underneath other artificial containers. And so it can be very difficult to get the product into these spots. So this is a very challenging species for the district to control. Add to that some of the control measures, particularly the adulticides that the districts are allowed to use. These are EPA. There's a very short list of products that we can use. The Aedes aegypti in particular has become very adept to basically evolving beyond the effectiveness of that particular control measure. So as time goes on, some of these insects become a little bit maybe exposed to some of the pesticide, but not enough to kill it. And then it flies off and it has mosquitoes again, and the next generation becomes a little bit less inclined to be killed by that control measure. This is one of the reasons why the district is looking at novel control measures, because we don't want to see a day when our last line of defense, which is really an adulticide product, doesn't have the knockdown effect that we want. So this is a very challenging insect for the district to control. And that's why we're ever looking forward to other methods of control that may be require a little less labor intensive, so we can get our personnel spread out over a broader area. So I could go on for several slides about it, but it's a very challenging species for FKMCD.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Dr. Zuba. We're going to finish up here with a quick word about Oxitec Aedes aegypti males. And I emphasize that because only female mosquitoes feed on blood. Male mosquitoes of any species do not feed on blood. They simply do not have the mouth parts. They don't have the saliva. They don't have the salivary glands, and they don't have the mechanics of the gut to ingest, imbibe, and digest blood. Males don't bite. Males don't feed on blood. And so the Oxitec technology focuses on male Aedes aegypti. Our male mosquitoes mate with the local invasive pest female Aedes aegypti. And that insemination leads to fertilization, right? So that there's nothing sterile about it. The females then lay eggs, and those eggs hatch, but only the male offspring live. All of the female offspring die. And we've demonstrated that last year in our field studies. We have 3 separate lines of evidence indicating that, 1, we released only male mosquitoes. We have line of evidence indicating that those that are sired, i.e. the next generation, only survive if they're males. And so all female larvae, all female progeny that are the next generation and the next generation die, but the males live and go on. And our last line of evidence is actually collecting all the mosquitoes in a neighborhood. And that's using an adult trap, taking those mosquitoes out and identifying which ones are the Oxitec Aedes aegypti and which ones are not. And every single mosquito that was an Aedes aegypti, Oxitec Aedes aegypti, was male. So we have laboratory evidence, we have evidence from larvae, we have field evidence indicating that if it has the Oxitec transgene, it will be a male mosquito. So it is extremely specific for one species, unlike broad area insecticide. It is safe and non-toxic and non-allergenic. The CDC and the EPA have written that it does not appear that there is any kind of allergenicity, any risk. This is something that CDC itself has stood behind. So there is no risk of being bitten by a male mosquito, and there is no risk of any kind of allergic reaction to male Aedes aegypti. And we say it's proven effective. We've seen ourselves that any female getting this gene dies as a larva. And so female mosquitoes that are the product of mating with one of ours do not survive to adulthood. We've shown that our technology releases only male mosquitoes, and remember, male mosquitoes don't bite, and it's traceable in the field. And so that female knockdown gene is conjugated to a fluorescent gene. So we can look under the microscope, or we can do a genetic test and say if a larva or a pupa or an adult is one of ours. So that means it's traceable, right? Even though they might be morphologically indistinguishable, they'll have a fluorescent protein when viewed under a fluorescent screen in a microscope. And the most important aspect here is that our Aedes aegypti males are kind of like a traditional pesticide in the sense that when you release, there's an activity and then it's gone. Just like spraying an insecticide, when you release our male mosquitoes, they mate with local females. Those females lay viable eggs. Their male progeny live, their female progeny die. But now, when that next generation male mates, only half of them are going to pass on the transgene, and then half of that and half of that. And so there's essentially a 50% amelioration of the transgene for female knockdown from generation to generation. Once you've stopped releasing, it is self-limiting in the field. I will defer to Meredith at this point.
Thanks very much, Dr. Zuba, Chad, and Rajiv. We're going to start our Q&A now, and we do have a few questions in the Q&A box, but I just want to encourage everybody in the audience to ask us your questions. We will see your questions, nobody else will, and we will not identify you, so you'll remain anonymous. Don't be shy. But we will start with the first question. And Chad, this will go to you. I know it's something we talk about sometimes. And the question is, have you heard of a confirmed locally originating dengue case in the Keys this season?
No. The answer to that is no, and I'm knocking on wood because really, and as Rajiv and Dr. Zuba can attest, that really only takes a person coming into the Florida Keys from somewhere else, maybe perhaps somewhere internationally, and be one of those 80% that is asymptomatic and not know that they have the disease, and to get bit by a local Aedes aegypti, and then that cycle begins, and then she lights on somebody and bites them and then infects them. That's really the only difference is really geography. And so the answer to the question is no. Knock on wood, no. Up to this point, we have not been advised. The health department, when they suspect a case, they oversee the blood being sent off to a lab somewhere, and then they share with us if any of those tests have come back positive. And so far, there have been several samples that have been sent off, but fortunately, they've all come back as negative as far as being a locally acquired case. It's possible that some of those people could have international travel, and it came back positive, and they've determined that it was contracted elsewhere. We're not privy to that. We're just privy to whether or not it's come back and been diagnosed as a locally originated. And as of right now, there have not been any cases this year, but boy, it's something we're always watching for.
Thanks very much, Chad. The next question is for you, Dr. Zuba. But Rajiv, if you have anything to add to it, feel free. I know this is a question that we get a lot. It's can mosquitoes transmit COVID?
That's a really good question. There is no evidence whatsoever that mosquitoes transmit COVID. So that will be at least one thing that people don't have to worry about at this point in our lives. So having said that, it's very important to continue all of our preventative measures for COVID. But fortunately, mosquitoes are not a vector for COVID. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Zuba. Rajiv, this next question is for you. And the question is a mosquito that transmits dengue sick with dengue itself?
So it's the question itself has some assumptions. Let's just kind of tease it out. Any pathogen that's transmitted by a mosquito or a tick or a flea can be transmitted one of two ways. There's what's called mechanical transmission and biological transmission. And mosquitoes are biological vectors. And that means they need to ingest a virus or a protozoan in the case of malaria. That infectious agent has to replicate in the gut of the mosquito. It has to be released from the gut of the mosquito into the female body cavity, and then infect the female salivary glands so that next time she feeds, she can inject virus through her saliva. That's a long process, and every one of those is a barrier. From the time the virus comes into the gut, the majority of female mosquitoes void the virus. So the majority of mosquitoes are not competent vectors. So then it has to get out of the gut, infect the gut, get out of the gut, infect the salivary glands. Every one of these is a barrier to infection and a barrier to transmission. So can a mosquito infected with dengue virus be sick? In a way, we see different kinds of pathology. But in order to get there, yes, the female mosquito has to be infected. So the gut has to be infected, salivary glands have to be infected, and it does take a toll on mosquito health. Obviously, it's not the same symptoms as humans. They don't have a fever. They don't have joints that can have arthritis, but there are what are called sublethal effects in mosquitoes. So a female may lay fewer eggs, or most importantly, in terms of epidemiology, often female infected mosquitoes have a limited flight range. Flight is expensive. It takes fuel. It takes sugar to fly. And a female mosquito's ability to metabolize sugar and use it for flight fuel can be compromised if she's carrying virus, because she's fighting an infection essentially. And the consequence for humans is she stays close to a family. And so an infected mosquito, if you look at outbreaks of dengue, it's often a child in a family, and then maybe a grandmother, and then a cousin. You know, an entire family gets infected while their neighbors might not. And so that's one of the consequences of the pathology in the mosquito itself, in that it limits the flight radius, and by limiting the flight radius, guarantees that there will be repeated infective bites by that female mosquito.
Thanks very much, Rajiv. The next question, Dr. Zuba, is for you. It's a good question. It has two parts. The first is, can you talk about the symptoms of dengue? And then the second part, or follow-up to that, is how is it different from other infections in the Keys?
Sure. Dengue is a really bad disease. They call it breakbone fever or some other names because it causes severe arthritis, severe pain in the joints, severe headaches, obviously fever. You just feel terrible. And I can tell you that in the last outbreak in 2020, I had several parents of my children that I take care of call me for advice because they had never felt so bad in their life. And sure enough, they went in and I told them to get tested. And once the tests came back from the lab, they did indeed have dengue. And they said it was the worst infection they've ever experienced. And clearly it is, the symptoms are a lot worse than most other viral diseases that we see in children and in adults. Specifically, even it's worse than influenza. And influenza can be deadly as well. However, the symptoms of the body pain, fever, etc., are not nearly as severe in most cases than dengue is when it is symptomatic.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Zuba.
Sure.
Rajiv, the next question is for you.
Was there a follow-up for Dr. Zuba? I thought that was a two-parter, right? What's the?
Oh, what was the follow-up?
There we go.
Sorry,
there were two parts to that.
The second part, I mean, I think he kind of answered it. It's how is it different from other infections?
Yeah,
here, I'm looking at the exact wording. It's how is it different from other infections in the Keys? And
sure, I think that the major thing is the severity of the symptoms. Even most people with COVID don't get the severe symptoms. nor do the people with dengue. But when you get dengue, or the worst case scenario, dengue hemorrhagic fever, which can lead to death, you can have, active bleeding, your blood does not clot correctly, and using any kind of ibuprofen or aspirin or anything like that can actually make the bleeding symptoms worse. So you can't really even control the pain. So I think that the limitation on the treatments that are available for dengue, supportive measures, is also a difference that we can attribute to dengue itself. Whereas in influenza, et cetera, we can use most antipyretics or anti-pain medicines without much concern.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Zuba.
Sure.
So Rajiv, this next question is for you, and I'm condensing it a little bit, but the question is, where is the data showing that this has been effective? And the question is referring to the Oxitec technology and the pilots that we are now in the second year running with FKMCD. But imagine we could talk about data from other things too.
Sure. Well, let me break it down into two. We've completed our first project in Florida last year. It lasted from April to November of last year. And we're replicating that project this year on a much larger scope. And so our really big objective this year is to show that release of our male mosquitoes results in a decrease in the Aedes aegypti population in the Keys. So in order to do that, right, we need to complete this year. The data are not publicly available right now, and they will take a couple years to actually collate and present out. For example, I would compare a similar project with Wolbachia, with using Wolbachia-infected Aedes aegypti to control Aedes aegypti on Stock Island in 2017. That publication just came out about 2 months ago. And that project was in 2017. It was in Miami in 2018. And here we are 4 years later, and we have a publication that has summarized all of these data. So these projects take time. They take years to do. We have to replicate them because that is what provides the structural scientific integrity. That's what gives us statistical robustness, and it takes time to analyze. It's not something that you just do in 1 year and then present the results, because that would be just difficult to extrapolate to anything. So we don't have a final paper yet, and we won't until the projects that really look at population control in the Keys are done. Now, having said that, our data to date, we have presented on webinars, we have presented at national and regional conferences, all of which were publicly available. They have been archived, and whether it's the American Mosquito Control Association, the Wyoming, New Jersey, California, Florida Mosquito Control Association, these were not behind closed doors. These were available to mosquito control professionals and to certainly to other scientists. We've also presented at the University of Florida, Gainesville. And so, yes, we have presented our data to date. It was not refined, right? It was not very sophisticated at that time because we were still getting data in. But we've been presenting along the way in national and regional conferences, on webinars, and the final really polished product is not going to come out for years. And the best way I can put that is, last year we were walking, this year we're running, and we need to get all the data from all these different sites to really show that, yes, we've already demonstrated that they're all male when they come out. Yes, we've demonstrated that our boys can fly about 50 meters and cover about 1 hectare with our boxes. Yes, we've shown that they have successfully mated with local females. Yes, we've shown that out of the over 20,000 fluorescent larvae, all males. So we've shared those data with the EPA, with FDACS, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We've shared those data on webinars. We've shared those data on national and regional conferences. All of that is out. All of that is available. We have not published it in a peer-reviewed journal, and we won't until we have finished the project and we really collate and analyze the data once the project is done.
And if I could add real quickly, that's exactly what happens in all scientific studies, and it's being done the correct way. There's no reason to rush. It has to be done appropriately, and as Rajiv said, scientifically valid studies. And that's why this collaboration is moving ahead, and we're finding things out at a pace that is consistent with any scientific study.
Thank you. Thank you both. And just for the audience, it was our 16th public educational webinar in April that we held jointly with FKMCD, where we reviewed in really a lot of detail the information from the 2021 project. And those materials and also the recording are available both on our project website, keysmosquitoproject.com, and on oxitec.com/Florida, that page. And the recording is also available on Oxitec's YouTube channel. Rajiv, the next question is for you. And the question is, how can you ensure that biting females don't escape?
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. We have a couple of fail-safe or stop guards in place. One, whenever we put our release boxes out, we always put a cohort box out as well inside a butterfly cage. And so what we are simultaneously monitoring what our output is. Same egg batch, same water, same food, even the same microclimate, except one of them is releasing and one of them we're trapping. So every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we go in with a vacuum cleaner, handheld vacuum, and we vacuum up all the mosquitoes that have emerged from the cohort cage. Every single one is male. So we know that everything else is equivalent, that we are releasing male. So that's one stop guard. The other is that we're also trapping. By trapping, I mean using very traditional surveillance tools, light traps for male and female Aedes aegypti. And we are trapping in various radii from our release boxes. We collect all of those traps, bring them into the lab, freeze them, look at them under the microscope. And we identify what is not Aedes aegypti, and that tends to be the majority, and what is Aedes aegypti. And so then we separate males and females and analyze which ones are Oxitec. Every single adult Aedes aegypti was male. So that's one of the lines of evidence that anything that's coming out that contains the female knockdown gene dies as a larva, and we did not collect any female Oxitec Aedes aegypti last year, and we did not release any female Oxitec Aedes aegypti last year. So we have these safeguards in place. It's not just, put them out and pray. It's release and monitor, release and trap, and make sure we're conducting surveillance to ensure that anything we're putting out is male, and anything that mates and then carries the self-limiting gene is also male.
Thanks very much, Rajiv. Dr. Zuba, the next question is for you. And the question is, why don't we see Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, and other diseases in the Keys?
Well, I like to attribute it to the great work of Florida Keys Mosquito Control District, number one, because we have the most amazing team of inspectors and pilots, etc., that go out there in the intense heat and humidity and rain and expose themselves to conditions that are swampy, etc., day in and day out, and do a job that a lot of people don't understand how difficult it is. And without Florida Keys Mosquito Control District, nobody would be able to live in the Keys. As a matter of fact, when we were talking about yellow fever previously, that was one of the biggest causes of death when the early settlers came to the Florida Keys. And because of our methods of larviciding, etc., adulticiding when necessary, and these newer techniques that we're trying, we help prevent these diseases from coming. All viral illnesses, however, go in cycles. As you know, influenza vaccine is changed every year because influenza virus mutates. And it will come back as something a little bit different next year. And as Chad said, since we use these insecticides and they're not 100% effective, these organisms, these Aedes, build up resistance. So that's why we have to continue to develop new techniques, new non-pesticide techniques as much as possible, I believe, for environmental safety. And we don't know if Zika is going to come back. It could come back this year. We don't know if dengue is going to come back. But the most important thing is control of the vector, as Rajiv so eloquently stated this whole presentation. If we control the vector, like any disease, we keep it out of the Keys. And I really do, and I really am proud to be part of this organization because they have a great reputation. They work so hard. And like I said, you wouldn't have a tourist industry in the Keys, and you would not have people living in the Keys without the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District.
That's true. Thanks, Dr. Zuba. We have just a couple minutes left, but Chad, there's one question that I think you can answer quickly, so I'm going to give it to you, and it is, how many mosquito species are in the Florida Keys? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I don't know exactly.
There's subject to interpretation there, but right, and it varies, right? Because our researchers are finding some sometimes. So I had to reach back and find it. But right now, I think Dr. Larry Rebar and others in our research department would tell me that I think we're working with about 55 right now.
Wow, 55 mosquito species in the Florida Keys. Okay, no, that's and this is me just asking this because I think it could be helpful for the public to hear. What percentage of the mosquitoes in the Florida Keys? What percentage is the Aedes aegypti of all the mosquito population Keys wide?
Well, as I indicated before, when we talk about the percentage of Aedes aegypti in relation to the trappings that we do, and that is, that in the Florida Keys, we trap a great number of salt marsh mosquitoes, and that's the largest variety of what we deal with. That's our nuisance mosquito, makes people miserable. I think if the researchers would say of the overall population, 10% or less for the Aedes aegypti.
Yeah, no, it's not that big of a number, but it's a big trial.
Not when you consider the amount of mangroves and swamps that we have. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all, Dr. Zuba, Chad, Rajiv, and thank you to the audience, everybody listening live right now, and the many who will watch the recording later. We appreciate your participation and look forward to seeing you for the next one. Thank you.